What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? NoZoupForYou here, and I've got some great news. You all might be aware of this already, but if you aren't, I'm going to give it to you anyways. German destroyers are finally getting a buff. Now, I think this is one thing the entire community of World of Warships has agreed that needs to happen for quite some time. I guess you really have to go back in history to the beginning of World of Warships. I mean, obviously first you had the United States Navy and you had Japan. And right after them came Germany. And at first, German destroyers were pretty good. I mean, the Z-52 found its way into many ports and it was used in a lot of situations. It was a pretty good gunboat, at least against United States destroyers and Japanese destroyers. However, as time progressed, other ships came out. Other nations came out. You have British destroyers. You have French destroyers now, which is way down the road. But it seems like after everything came out, the German destroyer line just became less and less potent. Russian destroyers came out, and, everybody had cabby fever. And look where the cabby is now. So a lot of the earlier destroyers have been kind of, I don't want to say they've been left in the dust, but they've been power crapped. And it's not deliberate that they've been power crapped, it's just the natural progression of the game. I will contest, though, that I still think the Gearing is a very good destroyer. And while I was never a huge fan of the Shimakaze, people still do really good with the Shimakaze. It just happens that the earliest lines of ships just got power crapped. Though I will say, you can't say that about every single ship, because I still think the Des Moines on the cruiser line is one of the best ships in the entire game, and I'll debate anyone to the bitter end on that. I love the Des Moines, and I still think it's a great ship. And Fletcher at Tier 9, going back to destroyers, is still a great destroyer. But we're not talking about USN destroyers. We're talking about German destroyers, which were very different. Their torpedo range was a lot shorter than that of their United States counterparts. Well, no, you can consider them counterparts. Adversaries, maybe. Definitely a lot shorter than the Japanese. So they were middling. I mean, you look at Tier 7, Tier 8, and the torpedoes were right around 8.5 kilometers. And they're not the strongest in the world either. They're not the fastest. I mean, they're fast, but they're not the fastest. And the guns, well, they hit hard, but the reload's kind of low on them until you get up to ships like the Z-52. Their AP was always very effective and worked well up close and personal. And even in this round you're watching right now, I wound up getting a Citadel when the time called for it. But they just started to lack as time progressed and other ships have come out. So finally, Wargaming has implemented, or is going to implement, a buff for them in 0.9.5. And I think the time's right, because many players feel that the German, not only destroyer line, but just German ships in general have been kind of left in the dust. And I kind of debate that too, because I think many of the German ships are still good. Especially the cruiser line. I still think the cruiser line is very good, and the battleships, they're not so much. They've been power crapped. I think out of all the lines, the destroyers and battleships are hurting the most. And you'll recall that when Grosser Kerr first came out, it was like, oh my god, this thing's got over 100,000 HP, it's a secondary monster. And here we are a couple years later, and Kremlin's out and has just really said, hey, guess what? You're not needed anymore. So, yes, we've needed some buffs to the line for the longest time. Many players have recognized this. Many players have felt that Wargaming has something against Germany, which I don't think that's the case whatsoever. I think out of everything, it's just taken them a long time to getting around to buffing things that needed to be buffed. I mean, there's still things in the USN line I feel need to be buffed. Same goes for the IJN. And will it happen? Yeah, I'm sure it'll happen one day. Maybe just not right yet. I think this was the case with German destroyers. It needed to happen, it's just up until this point, it wasn't, well, not yet. And here we are, and yet is here. Finally. So, I'm going to tell you what is being buffed, and whether or not I think it'll help, and obviously I think it will. I think any buff is going to help, and I think this is a pretty significant buff. So on German destroyers, the armor penetration of HE shells was increased from 21 to 32 millimeters for 128 millimeter guns, and from 25 to 38 millimeters for 150 millimeter guns. The change affects following ships: the Tier 6 Ernest Gade, the T-61, one of my favorite destroyers in the game, Z-39, the Liberecht Moss, Z-23, Z-46 at Tier 9, and yes, the Z-52 at Tier 10. Now, these aren't insignificant buffs to the armor penetration. I mean, you're adding 10 millimeters of penetration. That's huge. And Wargaming says, having studied statistics and following your feedback, we found the opportunity to buff German destroyers. In terms of firepower, they were a bit worse than same-tier destroyers. Can't argue with that at all. Now, with new penetration values, these ships will be able to penetrate the plating of cruisers and fore and aft ends of battleships, which will undoubtedly increase the potential for their main caliber guns and emphasize their versatility. And of course it goes on with the disclaimer that, testing, nothing's final, blah blah blah. And while I agree that this buff was needed to help against cruisers and battleships, it'll definitely help against battleships. Cruisers, if I'm really, really close to a cruiser, I'm probably still going to use AP. But I think really where this might help is against destroyers. And your gunboat destroyers that just fire insanely fast and you can't keep up with their rate of fire. And I think that's really where German destroyers have been hurting lately, where in the past, that's what people played German destroyers for. To hunt down other destroyers. They were the first destroyer killers out there. And over time, that role of theirs just kind of evaporated. It left. And the fact that they didn't really have any torpedoes that were spectacular against battleships and cruisers. I mean, they're decent enough. Z-52 has decent torpedoes, but they're not USN or IJN torpedoes. I think because you lost that ability to take out destroyers, many people just decided to stop playing the German destroyer line. I mean, I feel at this point they're very, very rare. I mean, I've probably seen as many Z-52s as I have Khabarosks in the past few months, and I think I can count that on one hand. They're just not played much anymore. So I think this buff will definitely help in survivability, especially against other enemy destroyers, because German destroyers do fire a little slower than most of the other destroyer lines. And when you're facing ships like the British line that just have rapid firing guns and heals and just survivability, not being able to keep up with them, it's tough. But now when you look at 150 millimeter guns, deck cannons that you can find on some cruisers, now with the increased penetration, I mean, that's a force multiplier right there. That is just an across-the-board buff that is going to make these ships feel a lot more comfortable. Now, I would love this to be just the beginning. Honestly, I would like to see some reload buffs on a couple of these ships. I really would. Especially the slower firing ships. But, first, let's take a look and see what these penetration changes actually do and take it from there. And I have a feeling that it's going to do a fair amount, and people are going to like these ships a lot more. So I just got to say, thank you, Wargaming. It's about time, and, thank you, because I do love German ships and the German lines, and if this renews my love in them, because I did really, really like the destroyer line in the beginning, if this renews my desire to play them, that's a bonus. That's a bonus, and I hope you keep it up. I hope you keep doing this to other destroyer lines, reevaluating them and fixing them. So, guys, this is definitely something to look forward to. Actually, this is probably one of the best things, the best news we've received in a long time. So, if you're a German, Kriegsmarine fan, You know, this is the news you've been waiting for, and I can't wait to try it out. I can't wait to see it implemented, and hopefully it does everything that I hope it's going to do, and revives this line and makes it potent again, makes it those destroyer killers, and just the awesome destroyers I remember. So, anyhow, guys, hope you're doing wonderful. Take it easy, and I'll catch you all later. Zoop out.